The wind howled like a living thing across the Montana plains, carrying snow so thick that Jake Morrison could barely see his own boots as he trudged through the drifts. The weather had turned ugly fast, faster than anyone had predicted. What started as light flurries that morning had become a full-blown blizzard by afternoon, the kind that could kill a person in minutes if they got caught outside without shelter. Jake pulled his wool scarf higher over his nose, feeling the ice crystals forming on his mustache with each breath. He'd been ranching these lands for 32 years, ever since he inherited the property from his father, and he'd seen his share of brutal winters. But this storm felt different. Meaner somehow, like nature itself had a grudge against anything foolish enough to be caught in its path. He was making his way back from the north pasture where he'd been checking on his cattle, making sure they had enough shelter and feed to ride out the storm. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees in the past hour alone, and the wind chill was pushing it down to dangerous levels. Even his experienced ranch hands had called it quits and headed for the warmth of the bunkhouse. The smart thing would have been to follow their example, to get back to his own house where his wife Sarah had the wood stove burning hot and a pot of coffee waiting. But something nagged at him, a feeling he couldn't shake that made him keep walking through the storm instead of turning back. His grandfather used to say that the land talked to those who knew how to listen, and right now, Jake felt like it was trying to tell him something important. The snow was coming down so hard that it seemed to muffle all sound except the constant roar of the wind. Jake's flashlight beam barely penetrated a few feet ahead of him, creating a small bubble of yellow light in an otherwise white and black world. He'd lived on this ranch his entire life, knew every hill and valley like the back of his hand, but in conditions like this, familiar territory became alien and threatening. As he crested a small ridge, something made him stop. Not a sound exactly, but a break in the pattern of the storm, a moment when the wind seemed to carry something else. He stood perfectly still, straining to listen over the howling gale. There was again, faint but unmistakable, a sound that didn't belong to the storm. It was crying. Jake's blood went cold, and not from the temperature. That was a child's voice. He was certain of it, though it seemed impossible. The nearest neighbors were 5 miles away, and no one in their right mind would be out in this weather, especially not with a kid. But there was again, carried on the wind, a thin wail that spoke of terror and desperation. He adjusted his grip on the flashlight and pushed forward, following the sound as best he could. The snow was knee-deep here, and with each step his boots sank further, making progress slow and exhausting. The temperature was still dropping, and he could feel his fingers starting to go numb inside his heavy gloves. If he was struggling this much, and he was a grown man with proper winter gear, what chance did a child have? The crying seemed to be coming from a depression in the land ahead, a natural hollow where snow would drift and pile deep. Jake half slid, half fell down the slope, his flashlight beam swinging wildly as he fought to keep his balance. At the bottom, he swept the light back and forth, searching desperately for any sign of life. That's when he saw them. Huddled against the base of a large boulder was a small figure wrapped in what looked like a pink winter coat. Even from a distance, Jake could see the child was shivering violently, arms wrapped around something dark and furry. As he got closer, his heart sank. It was a little girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, and she was clutching a small puppy to her chest. Both of them were covered in snow, and the girl's lips had a blue tinge that Jake recognized as the first sign of hypothermia. "Hey there, sweetheart," he called out, trying to keep his voice calm and reassuring despite the urgency he felt. "My name's Jake. I'm here to help you." The girl looked up at him with eyes wide with fear and cold. She was Hispanic, with dark hair that was matted with snow and ice. Tears had frozen on her cheeks, and she was shaking so hard she could barely speak. The puppy in her arms was a small golden retriever, probably just a few months old, and it wasn't moving. "My puppy," she managed to say through chattering teeth. "He won't wake up." Jake knelt down beside them, his mind racing through the options. The girl was clearly suffering from exposure, and from the looks of things, she'd been out here for a while. Her thin coat was soaked through, and her sneakers were completely inadequate for the conditions. How she'd ended up out here was a mystery he'd have to solve later. Right now, the priority was getting her warm and getting her to safety. "What's your name, honey?" he asked as he unzipped his heavy winter coat. "Maria," she whispered. "Maria Santos. Is my puppy going to be okay?" Jake gently touched the puppy's side and felt a faint heartbeat. The little dog was unconscious, probably from the cold, but still alive. "We're going to take care of both of you," he promised, wrapping his coat around the girl and the puppy together. "But we need to get you somewhere warm right away." The girl was lighter than he expected, probably undernourished, and as he lifted her, he could feel how cold she was even through his thick coat. Her small body was like ice, and she was shaking so violently that he worried she might be going into shock. The puppy remained limp in her arms, its golden fur matted with snow and ice. Looking around, Jake tried to get his bearings. The storm had disoriented him more than he'd realized, and in the swirling snow, everything looked the same. His house was at least a mile away, maybe more, and in these conditions, that might as well be on the moon. The girl needed immediate shelter and warmth, or she wasn't going to make it. Then he remembered the old line shack about half a mile to the east. It was a small cabin his grandfather had built decades ago for the ranch hands to use during cattle drives. Jake hadn't been there in months, but he knew it had a wood stove and basic supplies. It wasn't much, but it was closer than his house and would get them out of the wind. Carrying Maria and her puppy, Jake began the difficult trek toward the line shack. The wind seemed to fight him every step of the way, and the snow was getting deeper by the minute. Several times he stumbled and nearly fell, but he managed to keep his footing and protect the child from the worst of the impact. Maria had stopped crying, which worried Jake more than the tears had. She was becoming increasingly listless, her head lolling against his shoulder. The puppy hadn't moved at all since he'd picked him up. Time was running out, and Jake knew it. In weather like this, hypothermia could kill in less than an hour, and both the girl and the puppy were showing signs of severe exposure. The line shack materialized out of the storm like a mirage, its dark outline barely visible against the white backdrop of the blizzard. Jake had never been so happy to see that old building with its weathered wooden walls and snow-covered roof. He kicked open the door and stumbled inside, immediately feeling the relief of being out of the wind, even though the interior wasn't much warmer than outside. The shack was small and sparse, with a wood stove in one corner, a couple of old cots, and some basic supplies on rough wooden shelves. Jake gently laid Maria down on one of the cots, making sure the puppy stayed wrapped up with her. The girl's breathing was shallow and rapid, and her skin had a grayish pallor that scared him. Moving quickly, Jake began gathering kindling and logs from the small pile of wood stored beside the stove. His hands were shaking, whether from cold or adrenaline he couldn't tell, and it took him several tries to get the match lit. Finally, the kindling caught, and he carefully fed larger pieces of wood into the growing flames. As warmth began to fill the small space, Jake turned his attention back to Maria and the puppy. The girl was conscious but barely responsive, her eyes unfocused, and her breathing still too fast. The puppy showed no signs of consciousness, its small body limp and cold. Jake had dealt with hypothermia before in cattle and in people, and he knew the next few hours would be critical. He needed to warm them both gradually too fast, and it could cause more harm than good. He also needed to get help, but his cell phone had no signal this far out, and the storm was too severe for anyone to attempt a rescue mission. They were on their own, at least until the blizzard passed. Jake looked at the little girl and her puppy, both fighting for their lives, and made a silent promise. He'd brought them this far, and he wasn't going to lose them now. Whatever it took, however long it took, he would keep them alive until help could arrive. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the line shack, a small flame flickered against the darkness, carrying with it the hope that sometimes, when everything seems lost, rescue comes from the most unexpected places. The real fight for survival was just beginning, and Jake Morrison was determined to win it. The heat from the wood stove slowly began to chase away the deadly cold that had settled into the line shack. Jake worked methodically, knowing that every decision in the next few hours could mean the difference between life and death for Maria and her puppy. He'd seen enough hypothermia cases to know that rewarming had to be done carefully, but Maria's condition was so severe that he couldn't afford to be overly cautious. He found an old wool blanket in a storage chest and gently wrapped it around Maria, making sure not to disturb the puppy still clutched in her arms. The little girl's shivering had actually increased as the cabin warmed up, which Jake knew was a good sign. When hypothermia victims stopped shivering, it usually meant their bodies were shutting down. "Maria, honey, can you hear me?" he asked softly, kneeling beside the cot. Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked at him with confusion and fear. "Where are we? Where's my mama?" The question hit Jake like a punch to the gut. In all the urgency of getting them to safety, he hadn't fully processed the implications of finding a young girl alone in a blizzard. Where was her family? How had she ended up out there with just a puppy for company? "We're in a safe place," he said gently. "Can you tell me what happened? How did you get outside in the storm?" Maria's voice was barely a whisper, and Jake had to lean close to hear her over the crackling of the fire. "Mama and me, we were driving to Grandpa's house. Our car got stuck in the snow, and Mama said to wait while she went to get help. But then the snow got really bad, and Rusty was scared, so I got out to find Mama." Jake's heart sank as he pieced together what had happened. Maria and her mother had been caught in the storm, their car probably stuck somewhere on one of the back roads that crisscrossed the ranch. The mother had left to get help, telling Maria to stay put, but when the storm worsened and her mother didn't return, the frightened child had ventured out into the blizzard to look for her. "How long ago was that, sweetheart?" Jake asked, though he dreaded the answer. Maria's brow furrowed as she tried to remember. "I don't know. It was still light when Mama left, but then it got dark really fast." That meant Maria had been out in the storm for hours, probably since early afternoon. The temperature had dropped steadily all day, and the wind chill was now life-threatening. If her mother had been caught in the storm on foot, looking for help, Jake pushed the dark thoughts away. Right now, his focus had to be on the survivors in front of him. He could organize search efforts for Maria's mother once the storm passed, and communication was restored. The puppy, Rusty, still showed no signs of consciousness. Jake gently touched the small dog's chest and felt a weak but steady heartbeat. The animal was alive, but just barely. Dogs were actually more resistant to cold than humans in some ways, but a young puppy didn't have the body mass to maintain its temperature in these extreme conditions. Jake found an old towel and carefully dried Rusty's fur, rubbing gently to stimulate circulation. The puppy's body was cold and limp, but as Jake worked, he thought he saw a slight twitch in one of the back legs. It wasn't much, but it was something. "Is Rusty going to be okay?" Maria asked, her voice stronger now that she was warming up. "He's tough, just like you," Jake said, continuing to work on the puppy. "Both of you are fighters." As the cabin continued to warm, Jake took stock of their supplies. There was enough wood to keep the fire going through the night, and he found several cans of soup and beans on the shelves, along with an old coffee pot and some basic first aid supplies. There was no phone or radio, but that didn't surprise him. The line shack had been built in a simpler time, when communication meant writing to the nearest neighbor. Maria was becoming more alert as her body temperature rose, but Jake could see she was exhausted and probably dehydrated. He heated some water on the wood stove and made a weak broth from bouillon cubes he found in the supplies. The warm liquid would help restore her body heat from the inside. "Can you sit up a little and drink this?" he asked, supporting her shoulders as she struggled to rise. Maria managed a few sips of the broth, and some color began to return to her pale cheeks. As she drank, Jake noticed that her clothes were not just wet, but completely inappropriate for the weather. She wore thin jeans, sneakers with no socks, and a lightweight jacket that wouldn't have kept her warm on a mild day, let alone in a blizzard. "Maria, where were you and your mama coming from?" Jake asked gently. "Phoenix," she said between sips. "Mama said we were going to live with Grandpa because our apartment got too expensive. She said Montana would be better, but I didn't want to leave my friends." The picture became clearer. Maria and her mother were likely relocating, probably with limited resources, driving through unfamiliar territory when the storm hit. They wouldn't have known about the local weather patterns or the dangers of the back roads during winter. It was a common enough story, people drawn to Montana by the promise of cheaper living, only to discover that the state demanded respect for its harsh climate. As the evening wore on, Jake kept a careful watch on both his patients. Maria's condition continued to improve slowly. Her shivering had decreased, and she was able to drink more broth and even eat a few spoonfuls of heated canned soup. But Rusty remained unconscious, his small body warm to the touch now, but still unresponsive. Outside, the storm showed no signs of letting up. The wind continued to howl around the cabin, and Jake could hear the soft thump of snow hitting the windows. Periodically, he would check outside, only to find visibility was still near zero. They weren't going anywhere until the weather cleared. Around midnight, Jake was dozing in an old chair near the stove when he heard Maria cry out. He jerked awake to find her sitting up on the cot, tears streaming down her face as she gently shook the puppy. "Rusty won't wake up," she sobbed. "I think he's dead." Jake quickly moved to her side and checked the puppy again. The heartbeat was still there, weak but present. Rusty's breathing was shallow but steady. The little dog was deeply unconscious, probably his body's way of conserving energy while recovering from the severe hypothermia. "He's not dead, honey," Jake said softly. "He's just sleeping very deeply. His body is working hard to get better, and sometimes it means sleeping for a long time." "Are you sure?" Maria asked, her voice small and frightened. "I'm sure. See, you can feel his heart beating if you put your hand right here." Jake guided her small hand to the puppy's chest, and her face lit up when she felt the faint but steady rhythm. "Will he wake up soon?" "Maybe in the morning," Jake said, hoping he was right. "Animals are very strong, and Rusty has been taking care of you all day. That shows how tough he is." Maria nodded and settled back down, keeping one hand on Rusty's chest so she could feel his heartbeat. Jake added more wood to the fire and returned to his chair, but sleep didn't come easily. Every few minutes, he would check on his charges, making sure Maria's breathing was steady and that Rusty's heart was still beating. As dawn approached, Jake noticed that the sound of the wind had diminished somewhat. The storm was still raging, but with less intensity than before. He hoped that meant it was beginning to weaken, though mountain blizzards could last for days without a break. Maria woke as the first gray light filtered through the cabin's small windows. She immediately checked on Rusty, her face falling when she found him still unconscious. But as she gently petted his fur, Jake noticed something that made his heart skip a beat. Rusty's tail had moved, just slightly, but it was definitely a response to Maria's touch. "Maria, keep petting him like that," Jake said excitedly. As she continued to stroke the puppy's fur and whisper to him, Rusty's eyes fluttered open for just a moment before closing again. It was the first sign of consciousness since Jake had found them, and it filled him with hope. "Did you see that?" Maria asked, her voice filled with wonder. "I sure did. I told you he was a fighter." Over the next hour, Rusty showed increasing signs of awareness. His eyes would open for longer periods, and he began to respond more to Maria's voice and touch. Finally, as the storm outside began to show the first signs of weakening, the little puppy lifted his head and looked around with confused but alert eyes. Maria burst into tears of joy as Rusty weakly licked her face, his tail wagging slowly but unmistakably. The puppy was still weak and unsteady, but he was conscious and responsive, which meant he had survived the worst of his ordeal. "You did it, Rusty," Maria whispered, hugging him gently. "You're going to be okay." Jake felt a lump in his throat as he watched the reunion. Both the girl and her puppy had beaten odds that would have defeated many adults. But their celebration was tempered by the reality that they were still trapped by the storm, and somewhere out in that white wilderness, Maria's mother might be fighting her own battle for survival. As if reading his thoughts, Maria looked up at him with worried eyes. "When can we look for my mama?" Jake looked out the window at the swirling snow, knowing that the answer might not be what either of them wanted to hear. By midday, the storm had finally begun to lose its fury. The wind that had howled like a beast all night was now more of a steady moan, and though snow was still falling, Jake could see more than a few feet beyond the cabin windows. Most importantly, his cell phone was showing one bar of signal, weak but potentially enough to get a call through. Maria sat on the floor near the stove with Rusty in her lap, the puppy now alert enough to lap water from a small bowl Jake had put down. Both of them were much stronger than they'd been the night before, but Jake could see the worry in Maria's dark eyes every time she looked toward the door. She hadn't asked about her mother again, but he knew the question was always there. Jake stepped outside to try to get better reception for his phone. The cold hit him like a slap, but it wasn't the bone-deep killing cold of the night before. The temperature was still well below freezing, but without the wind chill, it was survivable for someone with proper clothing. After several attempts, he managed to get through to the county sheriff's office. The dispatcher's voice was scratchy and broken, but he could make out the important details. Search and rescue teams had been mobilized as soon as the storm began to break, and there had already been several reports of stranded motorists in the area. "We've got a car registered to Elena Santos reported abandoned on County Road 47. The dispatcher crackled through the static. "Been there since yesterday afternoon, according to the report. That your missing person." Jake's heart sank. County Road 47 was over 3 miles from the line shack, across rough terrain that would be nearly impossible to navigate in the storm. If Elena Santos had tried to walk for help from there, she would have been heading away from any shelter into some of the most exposed country on a ranch. "I've got her daughter here at the old line shack on the Morrison Ranch," Jake reported. 7-year-old girl and a puppy, both suffering from exposure but alive and stable. "Mother left the car yesterday afternoon to seek help and never returned." "Copy that. We got teams in the field now. Can you get the girl to a road where we can pick her up?" Jake looked back toward the cabin where Maria waited, then scanned the landscape around him. The snow was still knee-deep in most places, and drifts were much deeper. It would be a difficult trek to the nearest county road, especially carrying a child and a puppy. Negative on that. Snow's too deep, and the girl's still recovering. "But I've got a UTV in the barn about half a mile from here. If I can get to it, I can bring them out." "Roger. How soon can you make that happen?" Jake calculated the distance and conditions. The barn where he kept his utility vehicle was downhill from the line shack, but he'd have to break trail through deep snow to reach it. Then he'd have to hope a UTV would start in this cold, and that he could navigate back through the drifts. "Give me 2 hours," he said. When Jake returned to the cabin, Maria looked up at him with hopeful eyes. "Did you find my mama?" Jake knelt down beside her, choosing his words carefully. He'd learned long ago that children could handle more truth than adults often gave them credit for, but he also knew how to deliver difficult news without destroying hope. "The rescue people found your mama's car," he said gently. "She's not there, which means she did what she said she would do. She went looking for help. Now the rescue teams are looking for her, and they're very good at finding people. But it might take a little while because the snow is still deep." Maria nodded solemnly, absently petting Rusty as she processed this information. "Is she lost?" "Maybe a little lost," Jake admitted. "But your mama is smart, and she knows people are looking for her now. The most important thing is that you and Rusty are safe, and soon we're going to get you to where there are doctors and warm clothes and good food." "What about Rusty? Will they take care of him too?" Jake smiled. Throughout all of this, Maria's biggest concern seemed to be for her puppy. It said something about the kind of person she was, even at such a young age. "Absolutely. There are veterinarians who take care of animals, just like doctors take care of people. They're going to make sure Rusty gets everything he needs. Over the next hour, Jake prepared for the trek to the barn. He fashioned a makeshift sled from a piece of plywood he found stored behind the cabin, padding it with blankets so he could pull Maria and Rusty if they got tired. He also packed the remaining supplies from the cabin, including the first aid kit and some food. The journey to the barn was exhausting. The snow had drifted in places to waist deep, and Jake had a brake trail for most of the way. Maria walked when she could, but the snow was too deep for her short legs in many places, so Jake ended up carrying her and Rusty for much of the distance. When they finally reached the barn, Jake said a silent prayer as he tried to start the old UTV. The engine turned over sluggishly in the cold, coughing and sputtering before finally catching. The machine was designed for rough terrain with wide tires and four-wheel drive, but even so, navigating through the snow drifts would be challenging. Jake loaded Maria and Rusty into the passenger seat, wrapping them in every blanket he could find. The UTV had a windshield, but no real cab, so they'd be exposed to the wind and snow during the ride. But it was their best option for covering the distance to the county road where rescue vehicles could meet them. The trip to the road took over an hour, with Jake having to winch the UTV out of deep drifts several times. Maria held tight to Rusty throughout the ride, the puppy now alert enough to show interest in the movement and sounds around them. Despite the difficult conditions, Jake could see that both of them were much stronger than they'd been 24 hours earlier. As they crested the final hill before the county road, Jake could see red and blue flashing lights waiting for them. An ambulance, 2 sheriff's vehicles, and a search and rescue truck were parked along the cleared roadway. Within minutes of reaching the road, Maria and Rusty were wrapped in warm blankets and being checked over by paramedics. "You did good work," Sheriff Tom Bradley told Jake as they watched the medical team work. "Few more hours in that cold, and we'd have been planning a very different kind of recovery." Jake nodded, but his attention was focused on the search and rescue coordinator who was talking into his radio. After a few minutes, the man approached them with news. "We've got a possible sighting about 2 miles southeast of where the car was abandoned," he reported. "Heat signature picked up by our helicopter. Could be a person, could be a large animal, but it's worth checking out." Jake felt his pulse quicken. 2 miles southeast of the abandoned car would put the location in rough country, but it was possible for someone to survive a night in the open if they'd found shelter and had some basic survival knowledge. "I know that area," Jake said. "There's an old hunting cabin about a quarter-mile from where you're describing. If someone was looking for shelter, that's where they'd head." The rescue coordinator nodded. "Can you guide us there?" Without hesitation, Jake agreed. He'd come this far with Maria and her family's story, and he wasn't going to stop until it was finished. As the ambulance prepared to transport Maria and Rusty to the hospital, he knelt down beside the stretcher. "I'm going to help look for your mama now," he told her. Maria reached out and grabbed his hand with her small one. "Thank you for saving us," she said. "Will you come visit us at the hospital?" "You bet I will," Jake promised. "And I'm going to bring news about your mama." As the ambulance pulled away, Jake turned to the search team. The storm was nearly over, the visibility was improving, and they had a specific target to search. After everything they'd been through, he refused to believe that Elena Santos hadn't found a way to survive. Maria had made it through the worst night of her young life, and Rusty had come back from the edge of death. If a 7-year-old girl and a puppy could beat those odds, surely a determined mother could too. The helicopter lifted off as Jake and the ground team prepared to head into the backcountry. Somewhere in that vast expanse of snow-covered wilderness, a family's story was waiting to be completed. Jake had started something when he heard Maria's cries in the storm, and he was determined to see it through to the end. As they loaded into the search vehicles, Jake thought about the word that had been running through his mind since he first found Maria and Rusty in the snow. Miracle. Sometimes miracles wore the face of chance, of being in the right place at the right time. But more often, Jake had learned miracles wore clothes and carried flashlights, and they happened because ordinary people decided to keep walking into the storm when the smart thing would have been to turn around. 3 hours later, they found Elena Santos in the abandoned hunting cabin, weak and suffering from exposure, but very much alive. She had spent the night burning furniture for warmth and melting snow for water, never giving up hope that help would come or that she would find her way back to her daughter. When Jake walked into Maria's hospital room that evening, her face lit up with pure joy. Rusty was sleeping on a heated blanket beside her bed, his golden fur clean and fluffy, with a small bandage where the veterinarian had inserted in 4 for fluids. "Mama's going to be okay," Maria announced as soon as she saw him. "The doctor said she just needs to rest and get warm, and then we can all go stay with Grandpa." Elena Santos, despite being in the bed next to her daughters, managed to sit up and take Jake's hand in both of hers. Her eyes were bright with tears as she struggled to find the words to express her gratitude. "The nurses told me what you did," she said finally. "You risked your life for strangers. I don't know how to thank you." Jake looked at Maria, who was gently stroking Rusty's fur as the puppy slept peacefully, and then at Elena, whose eyes held the fierce gratitude of a mother whose child had been saved from the unthinkable. "No thanks needed," he said simply. "This is what neighbors do for each other out here. Besides, I think I got more out of this than I gave. Your daughter and that puppy taught me something about what real courage looks like." As Jake left the hospital that night, the storm had completely cleared, and stars were visible for the first time in days. The world was clean and white and beautiful, transformed by the same force that had nearly claimed 3 lives just 48 hours earlier. Nature was neither kind nor cruel, Jake reflected. It simply was. But when people chose to face it with courage and compassion, sometimes beautiful things emerged from even the darkest storms. Maria Santos and Rusty had found their miracle in the form of an old rancher who chose to listen when the wind carried something other than snow. But Jake knew the real miracle was simpler than that. It was the decision to keep walking forward when everything reasonable said to turn back, to offer warmth to strangers when you barely had enough for yourself, and to never give up on the possibility that lost things could be found again. 6 months later, Jake received a letter with a Phoenix postmark. Inside was a photo of Maria and Rusty in what looked like a sunny backyard, both of them healthy and happy and clearly thriving. On the back, in a child's careful handwriting, were 4 simple words that made Jake's eyes water. "Thank you, Mr. Jake." Sometimes, he thought as he pinned the photo to his kitchen bulletin board, that's all the miracle you need.